Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much for joining. Welcome to our PCI Fines and Assessment webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Jason, who ran you through last month's PCI webinar, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jason. So Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Jillian. I also want to thank everybody for attending today, for joining us on what is part 2 of our little PCI webinar series. Part 1 was a webinar addressing PCI DSS, what it all is, what it entails. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But today's webinar is addressing PCI fines and assessments. Our goal is to provide just a little bit of better insight to what the process all entails of defining and assessing, which is basically where the action meets the road on the merchant agreement part. All right, so here's just a brief outline of the topics we're going to hit. And I want to stress that this is really just an introduction to what PCI fines and assessments actually are. Every business that accepts payment cards and is party to a merchant agreement, this is a topic that is near and dear to their hearts. But I find it to be one of the least well understood topics in all of cyber insurance, mostly because it's kind of driven by contract. It's handled by an industry association that people kind of fear. So it's just a topic that's not frequently touched. So my goal today is to bring a little clarity to what the fines and assessments actually are, to better arm you for your conversations with each of your insurers going forward. All right. So again, just to retouch on our part 1. So why are we really talking about this? And I need to stress that every business that accepts payment cards, that's credit cards and debit cards, has signed on to a merchant agreement in order to accept the payment cards. And the merchant agreement, as mentioned earlier, is a contract between the business itself and their merchant bank in order to process, accept, and accept funds from credit cards and debit cards. And this merchant agreement includes both performance requirements, that's the requirement to obtain and maintain PCI DSS compliance, and then the italicized indemnification element, which has been agreed to by the business as part of this contract. And then just kind of brief. So PCI fines and assessments. So fines and assessments are two truly wholly different items. They are not combined essentially, but they are lumped into the cyber buzzword of PCI fines and assessments. So I'm going to try and break them into 2 different parts to discuss what they actually all entail. So first I want to hit on PCI fines. So PCI fines, these are monetary assessments or monetary values levied against the business by the card brands themselves, that would be Visa or MasterCard, for non-compliance with PCI DSS. Fines functionally are the stick utilized by PCI, which is the payment card industry, to motivate all businesses to obtain and maintain security compliance with PCI DSS standards in order to try and maintain the highest potential level of security for all credit card and debit card information. PCI fines are not a one-and-done event. You aren't fined and then you walk away. The fines will oftentimes continue until the merchant is able to confirm that they have been able to maintain to obtain and maintain compliance with PCI DSS standards. Now, as for monetary impact, they generally are not that significant. I mean, I'm saying this, I wouldn't want to cut the check, but they are not, in the scheme of what potential liability for a payment card breach could be, they are not a significant element of the overall loss. For a small merchant, this would be like a level 4 restaurant or a retail operation with fewer than 1 million transactions per year, the first-time offense for a non-compliance fine levied by Visa can be up to $10,000 for the value, for their non-compliance. Then there would be a subsequent fine for each month thereafter that that's levied against them for their failure to obtain compliance. It's important to note that the fines, they don't simply send you a bill and ask you to send a check. The fines are actually directly pulled from the merchant account of the business themselves. And the merchant account is the banking account that is set up with the sponsor bank for the process of accepting of payment cards. So the money is just simply pulled from Visa. You don't get the chance to appeal or other. It's just simply taken from you. So it can be kind of a bit of a shock to the system for most businesses. But that's what the fine actually entails. So the PCI assessment is actually it's kind of a unique thing. The assessment itself is not a monetary value. A PCI assessment is actually an audit that is executed by PCI to validate compliance with PCI DSS standards. It is executed by what's called a Qualified Security Assessor, or a QSA, who is a PCI-approved vendor whose sole purpose in life is to determine or affirm whether or not PCI compliance has been obtained or has been maintained. A PCI assessment can occur at any time during the contract period. It doesn't have to only occur post-breach. It could, if Merchant A were to sign on to a merchant agreement to accept credit cards on January 1, they could be notified on January 2 that a QSA will be arriving on Thursday to conduct a PCI assessment to determine whether or not the business is or is not PCI DSS compliant. And then following the execution of the assessment, a fine could be levied upon the finding of whether they were or were not compliant. But most common, the assessments are generally executed generally post-breach or compromise. They are not, the random audit or random assessment is not as common as would expect, and definitely not for small businesses. But it is something that has been agreed to by every business who has signed a merchant agreement. Post-breach or compromise, so following a compromise of payment card information, the assessment process will also include the calculation of monetary penalties or monetary values that are going to be levied against the business for their non-compliance with PCI DSS standards. And that monetary value can include counterfeit purchases made from stolen data, the cost to reissue cards by impacted issuing banks, and the cost to investigate misuse of card data. Now, those three components, those three dollar components, can be significant. If there had indeed been a card compromise and those cards were utilized in extensive fraud purchases, that can sting. If the compromise was caught relatively quickly and the cards were shut down and there wasn't much fraud activity, then really the only values that are going to be attributed against or charged against the business would be the cost of issuing cards, and the cost of investigation would not be as significant. So it's a variable value. And again, the monetary process is just like the PCI fines. The amount is generally directly pulled from the business's merchant accounts, and the money is just kind of literally all of a sudden gone. It's pulled from the business for PCI following the assessment process, because again, it's agreed to by the business as part of the indemnification component of their merchant agreement. So for the vast majority of small businesses, the PCI fines and PCI assessments really only occur following the determination or the discovery of a potential compromise of card data. So this is kind of really, for lack of a term, where the rubber meets the road of the fines and assessments, and is for the vast majority of us and the vast majority of our insureds, this is really the only time when fines and assessments will come into play. And I think it gives a good explanation or understanding of of what these two components entail. So the common point of purchase. For the vast majority of small businesses, this is the quote-unquote discovery of a data breach. So issuing banks, let's take for example Commerce Bank, Jason's bank, they will report fraudulent purchases to their card brands, Visa or MasterCard. So when I discover when I dispute the charge, whether I discover it on my monthly statements, or whether they contact me with some irregular activity on my cards, those disputed purchases are then tendered upstream to Visa or to PCI for their aggregation and analysis to look for commonalities. This forensic investigation, may hit upon a common point of purchase. So when they discover that Jason Bucher, his compromised card, and then compromised card A, compromised card B, compromised card C, all happen to aggregate to one common point of origin, meaning that we all shopped at a common place. We all went to the Starbucks over on 85th Street. Then that would be identified as what would be called a common point of purchase. And again, this common point of purchase is just where all those compromised cards intersect and may, I would emphasize, may indicate the source of a data breach or compromise. So the common point of purchase investigation. So that Starbucks on 85th Street, they will receive notification from the payment card industry via certified mail. They have been identified as a common point of purchase. Again, I must stress this doesn't mean that a compromise has occurred or a breach has occurred. It just means that they have been identified as a nexus of point where all those person A, B, and C, and Jason Bucher all happen to shop, and our cards intersected at this point. And per the terms of the merchant agreement, which was signed and agreed to by Starbucks on 85th Street, a qualified security assessor, that QSA, will arrive shortly to execute a PCI assessment and a forensic investigation. And it's very important to note that the QSA is not working on behalf of that Starbucks on 85th Street. They are at the direction of and the behest of payment card industry, and they're simply seeking to identify, was card data compromised, the number of cards that have been compromised, the PCI DSS compliance of that merchant, and the occurrence of fraud on the compromised cards. The QSA investigator is not looking to identify the source or the cause of the breach. They don't care. All the more they're looking for is whether or not the cards that have passed through that Starbucks on 85th Street have been compromised, whether there are more cards that have been compromised, and if they identify that card A was compromised on March 1st and card D was compromised on April 1, the presumption will be that there has been a compromise of data all the way of all cards between March 1 and April 1. They are not going to determine whether or not a compromise actually occurred. They're there just to count cards and identify whether or not they have been compromised. Fines and monetary assessments may follow the QSA investigation for the common point of purchase. So if they come in and they evaluate paperwork and discover that the Starbucks on 85th was non-PCI DSS compliant, they will be fined for the non-compliance. And then if there was indeed fraudulent activity on those cards, they may calculate monetary values against the business and charge them back. All right, so PCI fines and assessments and their intersection with cyber insurance. So as mentioned in our first webinar, PCI coverage, it must be specifically granted. As mentioned earlier, all fines and assessments are the indemnification component of the merchant agreement. So that's a contract that was agreed to by the business, and every insurance policy out there has a breach of contract exclusion that could prove difficult in the delivery of PCI coverage if that's not specifically addressed. So PCI fines and assessments must be specifically addressed by a cyber policy in order to have coverage specifically granted. The forensic expense is the most important component of a cyber policy in addressing PCI fines and PCI assessments. So as mentioned earlier, the QSA is not working on behalf of the insured. They're not hired by the insured. They don't, I don't want to say they don't care, because that's not nice, because I'm sure they're nice people, but they're not working on behalf of the insured. They're simply searching for whether or not the cards that have been compromised and the value of the cards that have been compromised. They are not searching for the cause or source of the breach, simply that a breach has occurred. So bringing in a forensic investigator who is going to work on behalf of the insured is going to be of a huge value. So if they determine that the merchant was non-PCI compliant, they will then start assessing fines. And it's entirely possible that the the compromise actually occurred downstream or may never even occurred at the insured. So having that forensic investigation to make that determination is going to be very important. The next important component of cyber insurance as pertains to PCI fines and assessments is the cost for a legal review of the insured's contract with the service provider. So most businesses, if the business has signed on with a point-of-sale vendor, determining whether or not there is some protection that might be available under that contract, determining whether or not that contract might provide some forensic supports, determining whether or not that contract could actually cover some of any potential fines or assessments levied against the business from the compromised card data. Those things are all going to come into play. And having a experienced legal team come in and review those contracts on behalf of the business and then help in the execution of those contracts is going to be of a huge value of reducing potential harm to the business. It is really important to note that this is not a common insurance component. I have seen it on some of the leading insurance policies. I am proud to say that ours does specifically include this cost for legal review, so it will help the insured greatly in their response to the common point of purchase investigation. So some additional considerations. So I really cannot stress enough the value of a forensic investigation on behalf of the merchants. As I mentioned, the QSA is not on their side. There is a pretty narrow window of opportunity to negotiate or potentially reduce any fines or assessments brought against the business following the determination of a card compromise. And getting a comprehensive forensic investigation that can determine whether or not a compromise has occurred, to determine whether or not the compromise has occurred as a result of the business itself or downstream, whether they were a victim of a hack or a victim of a skimmer. All these things can factor greatly into the potential negotiation of the reduction of an assessment. So monetary assessments generally don't begin until 15,000 cards have been compromised. That's a Visa standard. Each card brand has their different standards or thresholds for where assessments may start to, or monetary assessments start to accrue. But, and I put these 3 points in there because this is very important, there is a risk of lumping of cards. So let's say our Starbucks on 85th Street was client 1 of 100 of a compromised card processing service. And that card processing service actually had 1 million cards. And then they would then determine that of that 1 million cards and those 100 vendors, that's 10,000. I guess the math didn't work out well, but the card. So you could actually be lumped into a broader compromise, and that it would meet the threshold of 15,000 cards more quickly. Even though that your business may have only had 100 cards, you could be lumped into that compromise. So again, that's where the forensic investigation on behalf of the insured will go a long ways in potentially eliminating the assignments of monetary assessments. The card counting process. So when the QSA is coming in there, he doesn't care that Jason Bucher went to that Starbucks on 85th Street every single day for 30 days using the same card, and that's basically one card but 30 transactions. They're going to read that as 30 transactions. So their card counting method is looking to try and get to the 15,000 card threshold as quickly as possible. A forensic investigation on behalf of the insured is going to weed through that information and determine that 30 card count is actually only 1, and that can go a long ways in reducing the potential monetary assessments brought against the business. And then timeline review. Again, so as mentioned earlier, if they make the determination that card A had been compromised on March 1 and card D had been compromised on April 1, the presumption will be that that entire period of time has been a compromised event. That's just the way that they're going to assign it. So they're going to assign all card counting across that time period. Whereas a forensic investigation may determine that maybe some guy had affixed a skimmer or had compromised their network on March 1 and on April 1. But if, all the other days in between, there actually was no compromise of information, thus don't count to the overall record. So again, I cannot stress enough the importance of a forensic investigation. But anyhow, monetary assessments, they can be negotiated, but only if you have a solid team on your side supported by that comprehensive forensic investigation. Mind you, you're battling payment card industry, Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover. These are large corporations with extensive legal experience and a broad legal team, and on their side they have a contract that your business has actually has signed and agreed to. The scale is definitely stacked in their favor, but with appropriate information and timely delivery of information, the opportunity to negotiate down or even eliminate those assessments against the business is there. It's only if you've got a specialist team that can be assembled to support you. It's also important to note that fines for continued noncompliance are not covered by insurance. So following an assessment, if they levy a fine against the business, Generally that fine will be covered by, oftentimes is covered by insurance. It would be covered by our policy. But if they continue to be non-compliant with PCI DSS standards, those subsequent fines are not covered by insurance. The cost to improve or amend in order systems, procedures, or other in order to comply with PCI DSS, that would be an upgrade or an improvement of systems, and those expenses are not covered by insurance. Those are cost of doing business for an insured, and that's just it's not an insurable loss. And also the inability to accept payment cards due to continued noncompliance. So the way PCI will fine you, so they will give you a timeline to obtain PCI DSS compliance. If you do not meet their timeline, then they will functionally cut you off, and you can no longer accept payment cards as a means of payment. And if that impacts your business income, that will not be an insurable loss because that was tied to that long strain of non-compliance with PCI DSS standards. Okay, so a couple of resources. I actually kept these two links from the last presentation. These are very comprehensive links that give, I think, some of the best information out there on all things PCI. They have both of which have great FAQs, which can answer most of your questions, or you can link to send your insureds there as well if they have any questions. Those are great resources. Our data response team, most notably our breach coach team at Mullen Coughlin, they are some of the most experienced professionals in all of data privacy and cyber breach. They are, for lack of a term, absolute experts in all things data privacy. And most of the information that I have, all truth be told, has come from conversations with them over the past couple of years. They are excellent resources. And then your Schinner cyber underwriters, myself, Mark Scholes, Dennis Mahoney. If we can't answer your question right up front, then we will definitely do our best to try and find an answer for you. And then there's a contact information for myself or Matt Kletzley, our runner of our product here at Schinner. And then with that, I just kind of open the floor to if there's any questions that anybody might have. Okay. Now would be a good time to ask.
Jason, we did have one question come in. Just a reminder, everyone, to send your questions via the questions chat box. The first question is, so is the insured hiring their own forensic investigator? So upon discovery of the notification of a common point of purchase, that would trigger as a discovery of a data breach. So under our policy, it would trigger a data breach, and our breach coach would assist in the finding and assigning of a forensic investigator to work on behalf of the insured. That would, they'll find a person who is is experienced, capable, and is most likely to succeed in providing the best investigation for the insured. Okay. How long does it take to ID the common point of purchase?
Can be pretty quick. It depends on the nature of the compromise. My personal experience actually was 3 days, and this is actually outside of insurance. My card was compromised at a pizza place down in Austin. Their web page, their checkout page was compromised via an outside hack, and I just typed in my credit card number, and it was shut down. My card was shut down almost immediately because they ran off real quickly and ran up about $600 in charges of prepaid cards and prepaid phones and some other items. But the bank, they identified almost immediately because the occurrence of fraud on the compromised card was literally within minutes. Those banks that were impacted by those fraudulent purchases, when they reported it up, they quickly identified that pizza location as a common point of purchase, and they were notified actually in less than 2 days of their identification. Now, if the cards had been compromised and then were held onto for months or years, and then sold on the black market for compromised card use, that determination could be that much more complicated because you're looking at data that could be 9, 12, 16 months old. So each compromised event it's truly unique, and it just depends on the nature of the criminal that may have compromised the cards.
Okay, this is a specific question for a specific type of client. He says, I have a convenience store who says his credit card charges on gasoline go directly to BP. So is he responsible?
If he has signed if he has signed a merchant agreement, then that would, if it's, so I think I have to look it up because I don't know with convenience stores. But if they are party to, if BP owns and maintains the pump, and they are the, like as you say, the credit card never touches the convenience store, then they should not be responsible for it. But now, if they have a contract with BP that states that they are the collector of the card information and they are responsible for the maintenance and security of those pumps, then it would fall on the merchant. So it depends on their contract.
Okay, what about a business that still uses the credit card swipe rather than the chip? What does this leave them open to?
Okay, so the EMV, the chip is not related to PCI. That's a banking standard that was pushed forward by, it's called Euro MasterCard Visa, or Europay MasterCard. I'm sorry. And that a card swipe that doesn't necessarily make them non-compliant with PCI DSS standards. You can still be compliant with systems and procedures. The only thing that can bring levy fines or potential monetary assessments is if you are not PCI compliant. And as mentioned in the last webinar, PCI compliant is not simply signing on with a PCI compliant software system or a point of sale system. PCI compliance entails procedure and systems. It involves the completion of the self-assessment questionnaire, the execution of a penetration test quarterly, the addressing of any potential vulnerabilities, and then the like what term turning in the attestation of compliance to your merchant bank.
Okay. Why does a cyber policy not cover the loss of income if you are breached and can no longer take credit cards?
Because the shutting down of cards is only as a result of their continued non-compliance of standards. It's just, I don't know, I guess, I can't think of the exclusion off the top of my head, but it's a limitation of cover.
Okay, we can always reach out with a little bit more information if you want to expand. Another question, do Visa, MasterCard, and other credit card companies share research on common points of intersection? Yes.
So that's the PCI, Payment Card Industry, is an industry association of all the major card brands. And they are the party that is being, all that fraudulent card information is being reported to by the merchant banks. And it was set up for the purpose of sharing information across all brands and all banks. I mean, otherwise it would be wholly impossible to track or to identify potential common points of purchase or potential points for compromise. So in that sense, it's actually a remarkably efficient and kind of impressive vehicle. On the downside is, I mean, it's a pretty impersonal and it comes, to my eyes, honestly, it comes across as a little bit more bank-sided than merchant-sided. But again, I guess it's, that's which side it kind of set it up, so that's the way it goes.
Okay, we are almost out of time, so just wanted to answer one final question that came in regarding the presentation. Will there be a copy available? And there will be later this week on our website, schnurr.com/cyber. You'll see a link to all the cyber webinars, and you'll be able to access the presentation as well as a recording from this webinar as well as previous webinars. So just keep a lookout for that email where you will receive the link. Other than that, if there are no other questions at this time, then I think we are good to go. So thank you very much, Jason.
Again, thank you so much for all your time. I appreciate you coming in.
Bye, everyone.